Right, well, thank you very much. Yeah, so indeed, I'm Bouke Klein Teeselink. I'm currently a postdoc at the Yale School of Management. And indeed, today I will be talking about well-being inequality. And until then, let's see if I'm one of those people that's unbelievably boring to listen to for 20 minutes. Anyway, so the motivation here kind of just starts from, I probably don't have to tell anyone in this audience here, but arguably the most studied question in the whole well-being literature is the relation between income and the level of well-being. And kind of the general conclusion there, at least in the cross-section of income, and this is really the only thing I want to focus on today, and I want to stress that from the start, it's pretty clear that richer people are happier than poorer people. So this is Stevens and Wolfers. This is, of course, a famous Kahneman-Deaton paper showing that only evaluative well-being increases with income, whereas experiential well-being plateaus after, let's say, 75K, which was then later on disputed by Killingsworth, who showed that both experiential and evaluative well-being measures tend to increase with income. So in very short, it's hardly a controversial claim that money in one form or the other seems to matter for well-being. Now that's the starting point. So what we add, or to some degree contribute to that, is that indeed all this research I just summarized focuses on the level of well-being. Now, there's much less attention, some, including from some people in this group, of course, to other distributional characteristics of well-being. And again, it should hardly be a controversial claim that this matters, that indeed the distribution of well-being matters beyond just the mean. For a number of reasons. Well, there are pretty prominent philosophers and economists who have argued that insofar as we care about inequality as an outcome measure per se, we should probably care more about well-being inequality than income inequality. And secondly, let's say if you were to take some sort of Rawlsian perspective of well-being, you can quite easily make the argument that preventing misery matters a lot more than enhancing bliss. So indeed, lifting the well-being of someone who's truly miserable is much more valuable than enhancing the bliss of someone who's already happy, even if let's say the sum total of well-being in whatever configuration you want to measure that stays the same. So indeed, I would argue, and I don't expect that to be very controversial, that distribution matters. So this is exactly what we study. So we study in the cross-section of income, in the cross-section, what the relation is between income and the variance of well-being, and how the relative share of low and high well-being changes across the income distribution. So to do that, we use American data from the Gallup-Scherker Wellbeing Index. So indeed, that's 1,000 interviews per day in the US, after excluding all the data that isn't complete or relevant. There are 2.5 million respondents left, so it's a pretty nice sample to work with. We consider loads of well-being questions, but focus indeed mostly on the Cantor-Letter question for most of the exhibits I'll show you. But for now, just believe me when I tell you that all results I'll show you replicate, even when we consider experiential measures of well-being, such as enjoyment, stress, and worry, but also when we consider financial well-being or more purposive or life purpose questions, such as the quality of someone's relationships, whether people like what they do every day, whether they learn something new every day, and whether they use their strengths every day. This is just, by the way, a sample of the questions that we consider. Right, so diving right into it. What I'll show you is across 11 income categories that are defined by this Gallup-Scherker data, I'll show you the average level of well-being and the variation around that average. So starting from the mean, we replicate pretty much exactly what other people have found. Like, okay, evaluative well-being increases more or less log linearly with income. This is hardly new by any measure at all. But what is at least perhaps slightly more interesting is that the variance or the standard deviation of income decreases in almost the exact same pattern. So indeed, it's not only that rich people are happier than poorer people, they're also much more similarly happy. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. So I can illustrate that much more dramatically, at least to some degree, when I show the box plot of well-being scores for each of these income categories. So I think this graph really summarizes basically all our findings. So firstly, indeed, as we kind of already know, general well-being increases with income, but the dispersion, here measured by the interquartile range, goes down, and that's almost entirely driven by the bottom dropping out. So indeed, if you consider the 75th percentile of well-being scores in each income category, this is just constant across the income distribution, except for the very highest category. But indeed, between basically no income at all and people earn up to 120K a year, there is absolutely no action happening in the top quartile. Whereas on the bottom quartile—
Does the greed effect kick in and lower well-being in the top quartile?
Yeah, so
you get miserable millionaires, people that care more about money.
Well, so there's not much misery in these top income categories either.
No, but the lower bar, am I reading it wrong? The lower bar gets bigger again.
Oh yeah, right. So there are slightly more miserable people in the very highest category than the second highest, which is an interesting observation, but I wouldn't read too much into it because, of course, and I'll get to that later, these groups differ in much more than just income. But I do think it's somewhat interesting that indeed it seems to be the case that some slightly more really rich people are unhappy than just below that.
So we don't know if you can see the hand. We're just wondering if the red and the green, does green just mean above 7?
It's below median, above median. Sorry.
All right.
What does the line mean?
Sorry.
What does the line of the box plots mean?
Yeah, so in principle, the lines show the range, but if values are more than, I think if I remember correctly, 1.5 standard deviations away from the bottom quartile, they're depicted by dots.
Okay. Because so there's the interquartile range, then there's the red and the green, and then there's the green in the center.
This is the median.
Okay.
This is the mean. These diamonds. And then this is the actual range with outliers basically depicted as
red and green. Is that mean across the whole population?
Yeah. So just the population median is 7.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
By and large, yeah. So these colorings don't provide much additional information, but it does show you that effectively, indeed, like what's important here is there's very little action happening among the happy people. It's basically just that rich people aren't miserable, which is, I think, somewhat important to know. So of course, like as I already at least someone alluded to there, this is not the end of the story, because these groups differ by much more than just their income. Secondly, you might consider that there's some sort of ceiling effect going on, where indeed let's call it the real variance is actually constant throughout, but of course the higher income groups are pressed against the ceiling at some point, theoretically at least it's possible, such that it looks like the dispersion is decreasing. I'll consider that after. Then, as I already told you from the start, I'll show you some results for other dimensions of well-being, and I'll end with some policy consequences that I think are really interesting to discuss after, but we'll get to that. So starting with the composition part, so obviously these income groups are different. They differ in a lot more than just income. And of course, it's always going to be a correlational analysis, like I don't have random assignment of income. But the very least one can do is to consider that these groups are just very different in composition. For example, in terms of their age distribution, their health, the gender composition, how many people are married, number of children, religion, race, and educational attainment. So what we do, like kind of as a starting point to figure out, like, hey, what part of this decrease in well-being inequality, or the variance of well-being that we see along the income distribution, can actually be explained by these differences in composition. So what we try to do is indeed separate these two, like separate the part that is explained by all these other variables and separate the part that is not explained by all these variables, as in theory attributable to income, but I won't push that point very hard. So what we do here is some Waxegab-Leiner type decomposition, but then an OB decomposition based on recentered influence function regressions, which is effectively indeed an OB decomposition where you can use distributional characteristics other than the mean as your outcome variable of interest.
Okay.
So normally you try to figure out which part of these composition differences explains the differences in means, and here we look at the differences in variance. So what we do is we compare all adjacent income groups. So you need to compare the lowest income group to the second lowest to the third lowest, and so on. And then construct some sort of hypothetical scenario or hypothetical well-being distribution has that lower income group shared the compositional characteristics of the slightly higher income group. So indeed, in terms of all these variables that I just mentioned. And then consider the actual variance of the higher income group to the counterfactual variance of the lower income group had they had the same composition. And then the idea is that any difference between those two is at least not explained by compositional differences in terms of these variables. So what
The US, there'd be very big differences in marriage rates and in health status across income groups, more than anything else.
Massive.
Education.
Age is pretty, education rates, actually all of these are pretty big. So for example, education is a bit non-linear. So indeed in the second lowest income group, you have a lot of highly educated people who are probably in grad school, who are indeed young, highly educated, and very poor. But indeed, generally, of course, like the richer groups are much more highly educated, much more likely to be white and Asian, much more likely to be married, more likely to be male in better health. And actually, age is surprisingly constant. But yeah, so indeed, these groups clearly differ. So what do we find here? So indeed, here are the income groups ranked from lowest to highest. So 1 refers to the lowest income group, 2 to the second lowest. And I'll show you, well, here below you see the variance of well-being, which of course decreases, as I already showed you, with income. So I'll show you that the first row here will show you the difference between these two. The second row will show you the part of that difference that is explained by composition. And the third row is the part explained by income, which really just means not explained by composition. And well, so this is really what I want you to focus on. So a very large and significant part of that difference is explained by income. In fact, here it's even bigger than the total because the characteristics of the slightly richer group are more well-being inequality enhancing than those of the lower income group. But that's really not that important. What is important here is that this difference after controlling for this composition is very large and very positive. And that's a recurring pattern for all these comparisons. So indeed, I want you to focus on the third row here. It's consistently high, economically, statistically significant differences in well-being inequality, even after controlling for composition, with the only exception being indeed that comparison between the highest and the second highest income group. So indeed, even after controlling for composition, well-being inequality decreases with income. So is that a ceiling effect? Well, I can be pretty short about that. It isn't. This is for each income group, the fraction of people that rates their life with a maximum score of 10, which is almost, at least to me, very surprisingly stable across the income distribution, where even the very lowest income group has just about the same fraction of people who give their lives a 10 as the very highest income group. So clearly, if this were a ceiling effect, you wouldn't find a pattern like this. And of course, I've already shown you that most of the action is happening on the bottom anyway. But yeah, it's at least, this was surprising to me, but indeed the considerations of the ceiling effect don't really seem to be very important here. Yeah, then how about other dimensions of well-being? Well, here are 7 other dimensions. I won't show you the decomposition results, but whether it's satisfaction with living standard, whether people like what they do every day, and so on and so forth, consistently for each of these measures, the variance in these well-being questions decreases with income. So indeed, it doesn't really matter which kind of well-being question we consider here. For all of them, it is the case that rich people are much more similar to each other in their well-being. So yeah, as I told you from the start, that
Sorry, can I just ask a question before you switch? With the composition mattered more to the richer groups in terms of the differences across some of the top 2?
So so the fraction, so okay, the lowest two income groups are a bit different in the sense that the composition is negative. So ignore that for now, that's a different discussion. For the rest, it is indeed the case that the composition explains a larger fraction of the difference for the higher income groups.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I mean, presumably within each of these income groups, the within group variance, which is what you're talking about, must be partly explained by well, it's explained obviously by the structure of the equation for that group, but also by the variance of the right-hand variables within that group. So are you going to come on to the extent to which there are more differences between people in the low income group than there are in the higher income groups?
Yeah, so that's at least what the decomposition method we use tries to get at. To indeed try to estimate a counterfactual distribution where it takes the composition of that other group. So
I'm making a simple point. I mean, suppose that income were the only thing that mattered, and there was more variance of income within the bottom decile, then you would expect there to be more variance of well-being.
Yeah, but it's actually the opposite in the sense that the income groups are much wider on the higher ends here. So there's much more.
Well, the variance of log income.
Yeah, right. Okay, so variance of log income is reasonably constant. So then, so what I try to do, but that's of course always I'm not sure exactly how accurate that is, but you need to overlay the general income distribution of the US, and then try to figure out, okay, if all our subjects are sampled from that distribution, how much variance of income would we expect within each income group? Indeed, log income, sorry. And even there is slightly less variance in the lower income groups than in the higher income groups.
And what about these other variables that Carol mentioned, like health and so on, marital status?
So there I don't really have something to compare it to. So there the decomposition analysis at least purports to take care of that, where you indeed assume like, hey, if the distribution of health is the same in both these groups, then what would we expect the difference in well-being inequality to be?
No, obviously, if the right-hand variables have got the same variance, then there's something to be investigated. But if the right-hand if you haven't controlled for the variance of the right-hand variables within each of the groups, then you haven't explored this enough, and you're attributing it all to the average income, whereas it might be explained by the within group variation on the right-hand side.
No, I think that's a fair point. So I actually don't want to push the attributable to income part extremely hard. because I think one should always be a bit careful when doing these cross-sectional analyses on really making more at least semi-causal claims. So it's an attempt at trying to reduce the effects of these compositions, but I concede that it might not fully explain what's going on here. That's why I must be much more focused on indeed the box plot I showed you than on this. It's just that indeed this shows that even if the distribution of these characteristics is the same in both income groups, then we still don't find that different. Then we still find this difference in well-being inequality.
Right.
All right. Any other points before I continue? If not, then I'll get to basically the second question I asked from the start. Like, how about the relative preponderance of misery and bliss? So indeed, like how many very happy versus how many very unhappy people do you have across the income distribution? So to investigate that, it's an indirect way of investigating it, but it's through unconditional quantile regressions. So indeed, trying to figure out, like, does income differentially affect poor and rich people? Does income differentially affect happy and unhappy people, even at a given income level? So indeed, of course, like, we control for the same set of personal characteristics as before. And I'm not going to show you the regression tables, but we do consistently find that the effect of income decreases along the well-being distribution. So indeed, it seems to be the case that income reduces misery much more than it enhances bliss. So indeed, giving money to a poor person who is at least reasonably happy, it doesn't have to be a well-being score of 8 or 9, but even a well-being score of 7, giving that poor person additional income really doesn't do all that much, whereas giving a person who's equally poor, who is highly unhappy, extra income seems to yield much, much more increase in well-being. So indeed, that, and at least in theory, this can explain both.
Sorry, just a curiosity. Did you do the quantiles within each income group, or did you do the distribution of well-being across the sample? I'm just curious. Your findings very similar to one we have with quantile regressions in a much older paper, but.
Yeah, so indeed, there are papers before that have used conditional quantile regressions, which is, I guess, more the standard method. The only problem with using standard quantile regressions is that you don't define the quantiles based on well-being scores, you define them compared to other people with similar characteristics. So unconditional quantile regressions just say, well, someone with a well-being score of 1, someone with a well-being score of 2, how does it affect their well-being when you give them more income?
Yeah, no, we did something similar a long time ago with a Gallup World Sample, but I'm just curious if you did it with the well-being distribution of the whole sample, or if you did the well-being distribution within each income group.
No, so indeed, this is across the sample.
Okay.
Where we then indeed investigate for each, if you move, let's take the poorest income group as a reference, how does it affect their well-being when you move them up to higher income groups? So effectively what you get is you get marginal utility curves for each well-being score.
Got it. Thank you. Sorry, I just was curious how you've done it, that's all.
Can I ask a specification question? I'm finding the first from last bullet point very difficult to pass. The effect of income on well-being decreases with well-being, presumably. We always, for better or worse, estimate well-being functions using log income. In which case this bullet point seems to be rediscovering concavity, or have I missed out something very central here?
Well, that would be the effect of income on poor people. There's the effect of income on unhappy people. That's different.
No, I'm not sure I see that.
So indeed, so the
People with
concavity is,
low, no, go on, yeah.
so indeed, the concavity story is that people with low income, giving them an additional dollar, a euro, whatever, yields more utility than giving it to someone with high income.
Yes.
Here, it is two people with equally low income, one who is happy, one who is unhappy, who will get the most additional well-being.
In in a regression sense, how do you show that? You can't hold income constant when you're estimating the effect of income, can you?
No, so your income is the explanatory variable, but you estimate it at different parts of the well-being distribution. So rather than just taking the mean.
Oh, I see. Of course, this is a quantile, wasn't it? I see.
Right.
Okay, got it. Okay, thanks.
All right. Okay, so in short, so the title of the paper is indeed inspired by arguably one of the most famous opening lines of any novel ever, that by Leo Tolstoy indeed, and Anna Karenina, where he starts with, happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So you can call that an Anna Karenina effect. And we find something similar regarding income. So indeed an Anna Karenina Income Effect, where all the rich people or rich families are alike in terms of their well-being, whereas the poor families are much more different from each other. So indeed, we find that higher incomes in the cross-section are associated with higher well-being and lower variability. And this is mostly explained by misery becoming more rare, and not so much by increases in the higher decimals of well-being. So in theory, this gives at least a very good reason, additional reason to redistribute, right? So we already have the concave utility function reason to redistribute. But now on top of that, we get that giving money to the poor might reduce the overall inequality in well-being, which is something we might care about. And on top of that, it disproportionately lifts or seems to lift up the people who are miserable, which is something we might want. So taking at face value, if you were to interpret any of this as causal, which again, I'm not going to push, you'd have additional reasons to redistribute. But, and this is maybe something where I make myself slightly less popular by, if you are willing to make that argument based on my findings, you're going to run into a few very awkward policy positions. And to show you why, let me just briefly show you the exact same results, but then separated by gender and race. So indeed here, we have the well-being, just the level for now for males and females, where indeed females at any income level have a higher level of well-being than males. And these distributions are basically parallel, just a mean shift upward. So indeed, if we care more about helping the people who are miserable than those who are already quite happy, we should redistribute from women to men. Interestingly enough, their variances are basically identical. So indeed, anyone who is worried that this is just some mechanical feature of the data, that it is always true that higher well-being means lower variance, that's also not true. Because indeed, here the level of females is higher than males, but the variances are basically the same. For races, the conclusion should be even more dramatic. So indeed here we see for whites, Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians, the level of well-being along the income distribution, where indeed whites are least happy when they're poor and happiest when they're rich. So in some sense, you could argue that their marginal utility of income is much higher than for other races. So if you were to only maximize the sum total of well-being based on this data, you should be willing to redistribute from poor Blacks or Hispanics to poor whites. Funny enough, for the variance, we find a pretty different pattern, where indeed Asians have much lower within income variance than the other groups, which are much more similar to each other. So indeed, even though I think the results are at least interesting at face value, like I do want to give at least a tiny bit of caution before we draw dramatic conclusions from that. And that's actually where I want to end. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and open to any questions that come up.